Welcome back to another episode of A World in Tension. My name is Neil Placer, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rob McGarvey. Something that stuck out to me, Rob, as we were driving around was, you look at the Sermon on the Mount, and there's that discussion of prayer, but what's also in there is a discussion about what you let into your eyes to see. And, that Jesus talks about being the lamp of the body. So I think we need to talk to someone about what we're taking in, right? And especially in today's context,
we're consuming.
Yes, what we're consuming digital media wise. So where are we headed, Rob? Where are we going to find out more about that topic?
We're headed all the way to the other coast, to California, Santa Ana to be specific, to speak with Brett McCracken, who we are very excited to have with us today. And just to tell you a little bit about Brett, he is the senior editor and director of communications for the Gospel Coalition, which is a wonderful organization. He is the author of the book that we'll be talking about today, which is called The Wisdom Pyramid, Feeding Your Soul in a Post-Truth World. But several other books, one that I'd like to mention, Gray Matters, Navigating the Space Between Legalism and Liberty. Brett is a graduate of Wheaton College and also UCLA. He lives in Santa Ana with his wife, Kira, and two sons, Chet and Ira, and man, he has a lot of hobbies that overlap, I think, with us. Loves to be outdoors, I can tell, hiking, etc. Another thing that I'd like to mention is he's a lover of music, and his lists at the end of each year for notable Christian music is always a favorite of mine.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. So,
are you a Jervis Campbell fan? Do you like him?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, he's made a few of my lists and playlists for sure.
Awesome. Well, welcome to the show. Glad you're here with us.
It's fun to be here. Thanks, guys.
So I'm a consultant. I love frameworks. I love concepts. What I like about it is it's catchy from the get-go. So it's the wisdom pyramid, which is the analog to the food pyramid. So where did the idea come from? Why did you decide to write about it?
The idea came originally as kind of a visual aid for a conference talk that I was giving circa 2017, I think. And it was for the Humble Beast Canvas conference up in Portland. And they had asked me to give a talk on how to find Christian joy in a fake news post-truth world. So given this kind of chaos of not knowing what's true and information overload, which we'll get into, how do we find something solid and how do we basically thrive as Christians? So as I was putting together that talk, for some reason, I just kept coming back to the food pyramid and the idea of formation, because really at the heart of this is formation. It's a question of how are we being formed. So yeah, I just kind of drew out the wisdom pyramid sketch literally on a napkin and sent it to a graphic designer friend of mine, and gave him the food pyramid as a reference and said, could you make like a food pyramid, but for wisdom, and here are the levels that I would like, and this is the order that I would like. And so he created it. And it was funny because I think when I gave my talk and that image came up on the screen behind me, like suddenly everyone got their phones out and like took pictures of it. And soon after the talk, like that graphic went kind of pseudo viral on Christian Twitter. And I quickly like came to the realization, like there's something here, that's resonating, and maybe I should explore this as a book and just flesh it out a bit more.
Welcome to A World in Tension podcast, a place where we examine the opposing pulls and struggles of life to uncover clarity, purpose, and practical solutions. Come join us as we seek to get comfortable facing the uncomfortable. This is A World in Tension.
If it's true that our physical health depends, in large part on what we eat or what we don't eat and in what proportion, then the same is true of our overall spiritual health, our mental health, our wisdom. So much of it does have to do with our intakes. And in an era that we live in now where we're so overstimulated with intakes, and never have humans been so bombarded with choices from every different direction in terms of things coming into their soul, feeding their soul. In that kind of era, we especially need to be mindful of what those intakes are, and because we're being formed profoundly by them. And so that was the heart of this book. It's just kind of a a paradigm, a rubric for thinking about our intakes, thinking about our formation in an overstimulated age.
That graphic is a great hook. Like, and as I've talked about it, like I instantly got it. When I explain it to people and they know the food pyramid, they're like, "What's the book called? I want to get that." So I think you definitely have locked into the hook element of it. People love categories. If you give them categories to think in, they love it. But so before we kind of get into the elements of the pyramid, let's just talk about like the issue, right? Like this digital addiction, because it's so ubiquitous. All of us have a phone in hand. We kind of minimize it, but we all also know that rates of depression, loneliness, anxiety, suicidal ideation, people know this is an issue. How do you get them to take it more seriously and actually focus on like the weight of the problem?
There's a widespread just shared sense in our culture that we are not doing well. We are unwell generally in the digital age because of the digital age, because of the dynamics of technology that kind of run our lives and are so addictive. And what I found, which is interesting, is that there's a pretty widespread acknowledgement of that, but people still do it, and people don't necessarily feel the urgency or feel capable maybe of breaking those habits and drastically changing the way that they use technology. So yeah, I think for anyone who's not there, who's skeptical that this is a problem, there's increasingly large amounts of books, research that's coming out that's showing pretty convincingly, I think, that since the smartphone, for example, was introduced into the market in a kind of mass way in circa 2007, like all the metrics of mental unhealth really started climbing, drastically. And you mentioned like suicidal ideation, anxiety is on the rise, self-described disconnection, alienation, depression. Those are all drastically on the rise. And I think most people can say that maybe there's lots of causes, but we can't ignore the correlation with certain technologies and the timing of these things. And I think anecdotally, most people probably can admit that there is something experientially when you open your phone and you start scrolling. And we've come up with catchphrases for this, like doom scrolling. We're addicted to like the bad news and horrific atrocities coming across our feeds, but it's not making us better, right? It's making us more stressed out, more anxious, more emotionally just all over the place. And so I think people feel that. And so this book is really just acknowledging that. And we can talk about the first half of the book where I diagnose 3 specific areas where I think it's the technology itself is causing us to be sick in different ways. But my book, I really wanted to focus on a solution or a proposal for a path back to health and wisdom.
I was thinking about this as you were talking, and a lot of that is, directed at us as individuals. And I think even in your sections, you lay out good scriptural arguments for each of the layers. Do you think you could make a case that the church, in a sense, should be doing more to educate its members about this? And in a sense, like, do we need the church to be sounding the alarm bell here and getting engaged with its members?
I think that technology and media habits are a discipleship issue, to go back to that central idea of formation. So much of what the church is about is forming people in the likeness of Christ and in the direction of biblical living, biblical wisdom. But we only go to church for a couple hours every week. And then the rest of our lives, upwards of 60, 70 hours a week. There's new statistics every year about like how much total screen time on average we have. Mm-hmm. But it's just no comparison in terms of like that is formation too. And that is forming people profoundly, often in diametrically opposed direction from the way of Jesus and the way of biblical wisdom. And so that means that we're in a battle of formation. I wrote an article a couple of years ago for the Gospel Coalition, the headline, "The Search Bar is a Spiritual Battleground." And I think that it's true, and pastors and church leaders need to see this as an urgent matter of discipleship. There should be sermon series about media and just kind of informing people about media dynamics and relating it to biblical wisdom in the Proverbs and other places. And I definitely think pastors should see this as not only an appropriate topic, but an urgent topic.
And I really like how you've classified it according to habits that align with sort of the food pyramid in terms of eating, right? Like you say, there's 3 habits: eating too much, so information gluttony; eating too fast, which is perpetual novelty, which I can totally relate with; and then eating only what tastes good to us, which is the look within autonomy, right? So just kind of process through a little bit each one of those and sort of how those impact us.
Yeah, I mean, so the too much information gluttony is just the problem of being so overstimulated with more information than we know what to do with, right? And we all know this is true when we Google a simple question like, how to sleep train your child, or best, I'm using baby examples because I have 3 kids under 5, like best stroller for 2 babies. Like there's too much information to be helpful. And you end up being more overwhelmed than you started with, because suddenly you have contradictory opinions, and this expert says this is best, and this expert says this. And we saw this to a really troubling degree during COVID, I think, during the pandemic, right? In real time, we were all trying to figure out like, what's the best thing to do? Like masks, are they useful? Like social distancing? And you could find whatever you wanted to find online because there's so much space. There's so much room for every bit of information of every different perspective and persuasion and political, tribe, that you end up finding what you want to find. And that's one of many problems of like too much information. It becomes less helpful, to say nothing of how much it burdens our brains. And I talk about the science that's out there that's showing our brains are kind of struggling to keep up with the onslaught of information in the information age. And it's actually rewiring our brains a little bit to become kind of more adept at surface level kind of skimming, but not as adept at like deep level critical thinking. Which makes sense if you think about the way we interact in an information gluttony type of environment. We have to kind of strip mine for information. We have to just like grab what we need and then leave. And I even find myself like scanning articles on CNN or wherever, whatever the case may be, and just kind of scanning it for headlines or keywords or quotes. And people, myself included, who used to be able to like focus on like reading long stretches of like a really meaty book, I'm finding myself less and less able to do that. And I think it has to do with this rewiring of our brains dynamic that is happening with the information overload. So that's the first one.
So hold on, let me cut in. So
yeah.
like if we're pastoring that, right, to Rob's question, so the answer is obviously if you're eating too much food, should the pastor's church environment be talking about, okay, you need to like your daily consumption needs to go to a certain level? I mean, what would your advice be basically?
That's where like the screen time tracker on your phone is helpful, because you can be aware of like, oh wow, I'm being in this environment a bit too much. But I also think it speaks to the need for awareness of, given the glut of information and the excess of experts and voices out there, like it speaks to the need for like a smaller trusted circle of places online where you can feel comfortable pointing people, in your congregation.
So, I mean, in a sense, is that to some extent one of the missions of the Gospel Coalition?
Yeah, totally. And people often ask me in the course of this conversation about the wisdom pyramid, they point out the irony of like, you're working for an internet company, a
Right.
website. Right? So
I was feeling it. I was feeling it a
you're
little bit. Just coming
you
on.
professionally, for a living, you like add content to this information saturated environment. And totally, I think that's a fair question. And sometimes I honestly like wrestle with that myself. Like, am I just adding to the noise? Is what we do really helpful? But I think what you pointed out is what I would say is we are trying to be that trusted, one of those trusted curators that in a landscape of so many voices of dubious trustworthiness, we hopefully are going to be a place that offer people guidance on everyday life and the big questions that are facing people in our culture. You know, what I do at the Gospel Coalition, I focus on the arts and music, which kind of speaks to that beauty level of the wisdom pyramid. And so part of how I justify like getting my paycheck from an internet-based company, even though I generally, don't think online content is largely helpful, is because I'm pointing people, everything I do is trying to point people to the good and the true and the beautiful. The playlists that I create are trying to help people navigate this overwhelming amount of music out there by showcasing, here's what I think you should spend your time listening to because it's edifying and beautiful. So yeah, I think we need Christians who are playing that role of helping guide people through the environment of information overload.
Thank you for talking about things like beauty. It can get so by the book, literally, that people miss the beauty of Jesus behind all of it. So we'll go there, but I just want to say thank you. So let's finish off the other ones. The eating too fast. What's the issue, and what's the advice, the pastoring advice you think a pastor could say?
The issue there is not the sheer amount of information, but the speed of information in our current digital age. And I think it's clear why this is bad for our wisdom, right? Because wisdom is a slower burn, right? It's considering things deeply. It's critically evaluating things. And the speed of the internet age just isn't conducive to that. Like everything online, everything on social media is fueled by this need for perpetual novelty, for moving on to the next thing. Even like Netflix, in the way that you finish watching one thing and before like 5 seconds of the credits roll, it like moves on to the next thing. It's what TikTok is. It's like 10 seconds of this, then moving on to the next thing. It's what Twitter is. It's what all of them are. And the speed is not only bad for our wisdom because we're never reflective about anything. We never take time to think deeply or to critically assess it. But it's also bad because I think it conditions us to make really snap judgments and to be inclined to have really strong opinions that are like visceral reactions to that thing we just saw. And it leads us to then maybe share something or post something in response that's way too hasty. We did not slow down enough to consider what we're about to say and the ramifications of it. You don't really listen to one another. You care more about kind of sounding off your own opinion, and we're quick to become angry at one another. We like rush to rage on social media, and all of that is the opposite of the wisdom that the Bible would give us on this. So the first one is too much information. The second one is too fast information. The third one is information that's too focused on me. So the algorithmic orientation of information in the digital age, in the social media age particularly. And this is a problem because, our fallen nature is already inclined to do what is right in our own eyes, which is the downfall of people in the book of Judges. That's the phrase, right? They did what was right in their own eyes, and it didn't turn out well. And in the social media age, information is structured around you so that everything reinforces what you already believe and what you're inclined to believe is true. And so we all end up getting entrenched in these very dangerous kind of mirror like images of ourselves, where what we see of the world increasingly is more of just our beliefs, what we want to see. And no two people are seeing the same reality because of this algorithmic structure of information. And it's just making this inherent foolishness of fallen mankind worse, because we already are disinclined to want to listen to others and to kind of trust in someone other than ourselves. We'd rather just go with our gut and go with our instinct. And now social media and Google and all of these algorithms are saying, yeah, you are right, right? What your flesh, what your desires are leading you to want, here it is for you. Click on it. You want to, you can't resist. And that's super dangerous for a lot of reasons. So the path of wisdom, I think, is to get outside of that, to get outside of yourself, reading books by people you might disagree with, instead of only reading things that are going to reinforce, your perspective on every point. So that's it. Those are the three sources of our sickness that I highlight in the first half of the book.
One of the things that we've heard throughout our virtual road trip is that the church can be a place where we can exercise our dissonance muscle. If we're only hearing things from the perspective of what's been curated for us as individuals, we miss, I think, the whole story. And so I really think there's a role there for the church to be, encouraging its parishioners to be able to listen and engage with things that are not maybe what they would ordinarily hear. Do you think there's a role in encouraging folks to think a little more broadly?
Yeah, totally. I think that the local church at its best is a community of unity in diversity, right? So it's one of the last places, I think, in our contemporary age where so much of our lives are lived online and in these echo chambers of like-mindedness and homogenous interests. The church is it's a group of people made up of different generations, different ethnicities, different classes, different backgrounds. And that's only good for our wisdom, because it forces us to get outside of ourselves and to listen to different experiences within this safe kind of shared framework of pursuing the same thing. We're all going in the same direction, right? We're all going in the direction of Christ-likeness, but we're coming from different places and we have different perspectives. And that's the beauty of the church of Jesus Christ, is it's a diverse community. And it's one of the last, I think, diverse communities that people might have a regular touch point with in today's age.
So let's start to get into the wisdom pyramid. So there's the 6 layers. And what I like what you did about the construct is you have a base and it goes up the 6 layers. And what's important to remember in this conversation is that you need the bottom layers. So the bottom layer is the Bible. The second is the church. The third is nature. The fourth is books. The fifth is beauty. And the sixth is actually, you come back to the internet and social media as that can be used. I think the Bible is really clear. I mean, I don't want to actually spend a lot of time there, because I think if you're a believing Christian, you know that that's fundamental and important. So let's just jump to the second layer, which is the church. And there's a lot of ways you can take the church. This season is about what we can do collectively as the church. What do you think people miss the most in terms of their collective role in the local body, in terms of how that builds their wisdom? Because I don't think a lot of people look at churches building their wisdom. They almost view it as something to consume or something to serve in, but it's not like a wisdom growth area. So talk a little bit about that second one.
Yeah, I mean, to connect it to the first layer, the Bible, I would say a really important function of the church is that it's a community of biblical interpretation and application. So if the Bible is our most foundational source of wisdom, that's great, but let's be honest, it's a hard book to read. It's distant from us, temporally, it's distant from us culturally. It's this ancient Near Eastern text that's super hard to understand, especially if you're a newer believer who has no biblical literacy whatsoever. So a church community is vital for taking that perfect, infallible source of wisdom of the Bible and actually bringing it down to the level of, I can understand this. I can talk about it with my small group, and we can actually apply this to our lives in a meaningful way. So I think the community of biblical interpretation is a big part of why the church is so essential for our wisdom. A couple other things I would say, the church is an embodied community. So if so much of our foolishness is coming from the fact that we're living increasingly disembodied lives through screens, and there's a lot of foolishness that can come with that, to be in an in-person embodied local church community, there's just wisdom to that. Going to the same place week after week, doing these physical embodied things like using our voice, our vocal cords to sing together, and hearing our brothers and sisters in Christ voices singing with us. Taking the physical elements of communion, seeing the physical sacrament of baptism, shaking physical hands, giving physical hugs. These are all like embodied activities that give us wisdom. It's like caught rather than taught, right? Like the motions that we go through in life teach us sometimes more than the cerebral concepts that we see in a TED Talk on YouTube.
That theme you just said has been such a part of this season, which is you're talking about relational elements. Like if you just focused on the book without the relational elements, I can't learn from, like you're saying, catching it or discussion. That theme, you're tracking with it.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm glad that that's come up a lot, because it's so essential, and especially with all this talk about online church that COVID necessarily brought to the surface. Can we do church just by sitting at home watching it on a screen? I would say resoundingly no, because God made us to be embodied creatures rather than just heads that process information. He made us to have voices to sing and bodies to embrace and stand shoulder to shoulder alongside fellow worshipers at church. So that's a huge part of it. The other thing, the connectedness to church history and the tradition of church passed down generation to generation in an age where digital life is so disposable and it's so presentist, meaning the past is increasingly irrelevant and the future is something that we don't really think too much about because we live in this moment. It's Instagram, right? We live in the instant moments. That's unhealthy for our wisdom, because so much of wisdom comes from a bigger view, right? Taking kind of the long view of past, present, future. And the church really powerfully situates us in that continuum. Even in the act of communion, I often think about like when we take the Lord's Supper, it's this weird kind of eternal act where we're simultaneously connecting to the church 2,000 years ago, the Last Supper, the disciples taking the elements, but we're also looking ahead to our eternal future where we'll have the marriage supper of the Lamb. And yet we're doing this activity now in the present moment. And I think so much of what church is this kind of almost like a postcard from eternity, where we are practicing in a temporal space for a few hours on Sunday. We are doing what we will be doing for eternity, which is worshiping Christ in community, with fellow saints. And I think nothing could be better for our wisdom than to kind of practice our eternal destiny in that way. So, I mean, there's more I could say. Church is a huge passion for me. I wrote my book, Uncomfortable, is all about an argument for the local church commitment in today's kind of consumer culture.
I really appreciate that. I think that's happening maybe in the younger generations, that it's kind of like, what's the point, right? But I would say, man, you're the group that's suffering the most from isolation. You totally need this. But let's move to the third level, which is nature. And this is where I was saying people may start to like wig out a little bit, because I think a lot of people in Christianity would say, I have the Bible, I have the church. What else is needed? You're talking about nature. You're an environmentalist. That's liberal. Whatever. Please correct the thinking and explain how nature and why did you pick that third, right? Like what, as opposed to the other ones like the fall in the pyramid?
Well, I picked it third because my structuring logic from the bottom up, I go from, it's kind of all about proximity to God, right? So going from the direct from the source to increasingly removed. So with the Word of God, his direct revelation, that's the Bible. The church is proximate to God because it's an institution that he formed. His Holy Spirit is the one creating this community. It's the body of Christ on earth. The Bible uses that language for the church. Nature is God's creation. It's his handiwork. So there's proximity to God in nature because it's literally his artwork. It's in the same way that Van Gogh's Starry Night is proximate to Van Gogh because it's something he physically created and came out of his own mind. That's what nature is. So there's a beautiful proximity to God, Logos, the source of wisdom himself, in what he created. And the Bible itself, tells us this. There's passages like Psalm 19 where it talks about the heavens declare the glory of God, the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Paul talks about it in Romans 1 in terms of, even if you've never heard the specific revelation of Christ in the gospel, there's a general revelation by virtue of what God made in the world. We are without excuse to know certain things about the Creator by paying attention to his creation. And in Christian tradition, going back many centuries, it's not a far-fetched concept to think about the two books of creation, right? God's special revelation, the Bible, and his general revelation, the book of nature, if you will. And of course, the special revelation of Scripture, holds a higher place for us because it's clear. It's there is a specificity to it that nature is a little harder to read. But the two should be harmonious, right? The same author of Scripture is the author of nature. And so any talk of like some sort of conflict between science and faith is just bunk in my mind, because if science is the study of nature and theology is the study of the Bible, they should be harmonious because they're studying things that were created by the same author. And so I really advocate for Christians to be in the sciences. We should have the best reason to be in the sciences. I know both of you kind of do things that are science adjacent. I love seeing Christians in the sciences because it is the study of God's handiwork. That's what science is. It's looking at the design, his design for nature and his creation. And there's so much beauty and mystery and truth there. And we can find all these interesting kind of correspondences with his special revelation in Scripture.
I think I kind of led you to make a case for nature, but like, how do we also, as we go through each one of them, like, how are we learning from them? How are we getting so let's just talk about nature. I mean, I totally get, I got some beautiful, we hiked the Grand Canyon, beautiful, right? Like, how can you look at this and not say this is majestic, right? And what that does to your soul. But like, what would you say, how does nature teach us? How does it grow us in wisdom? Because it is more subjective, right? It's not like the biblical text.
Yeah. I think one of the big things that it does is it humbles us, and humility, I believe, is super foundational for wisdom. The wisest people that I know personally tend to be some of the humblest people. And when you go to the Grand Canyon, you can't help but be humbled, right? Because you're just this tiny little human before this enormous kind of sublime creation of God. You look up to the stars and you see the sheer scope of the cosmos, and you can't help but be humbled. And foolishness comes in large part by having a higher view of ourselves than we ought to have, starting to like have a godlike complex where we believe we are the creator, and we can manipulate things to our preferences and our liking. But nature, for example, weather, is something we can't manipulate, right? It's either raining or it's not. It isn't what we want it to be. And so the more you kind of expose yourself to creation and nature, the more you're reminded in a really healthy way that you are not in control of things. And there's an uncontrollability to the world, that we as the creature, we are subject to the laws of nature, right? Gravity, for example, is a law of nature that we can't just overcome. We can't just fly just because we like that Superman can fly. Like we can't snap our fingers and have a tree just pop out of the ground. Like there are laws and cycles and rhythms to nature as God designed it, and we are subject to them. And so I think that creator creature distinction is the heart of it for me. Nature helps us to become wise because it really, really confronts us with the fact that God is God and we are not.
There's an ultra runner that Neil and I follow a little bit. And he says specifically he's not particularly religious, but his journey through the Grand Canyon helped him see God. I mean, that really is such a beautiful thing that even someone who doesn't know the Creator the way a Christian does can experience something of God, and that may be part of their journey to Christ. I'm really glad that you included that in your pyramid.
I love that Christians are surprised, to see it in such a prominent location, and also to come in the context of a very conservative overall book. Like I'm not like a tree hugging liberal. I think environmentalism is good and Christians should care about creation, but I'm talking about nature as a revelation of God. Like it's a way he communicates to us. And that is, for me, that's the most compelling argument for ecology and preserving creation, is to think about how this is God's handiwork. It's his masterpiece. He is trying to communicate things to us through what he made. And if we just disregard that and let it kind of fall to waste, we're literally snuffing out the voice of God in creation.
Okay, so moving to the fourth level of books. I mean, one of the things I really was just like super underlining was you saying read books of diverse genres, read different perspectives, even non-Christians. I'm like, thank you for saying that. I'm not joking. Like I think because our tribes have become so narrow, we're even afraid to say that. I mean, I remember sitting in like a Wednesday night service and I said, would we be willing to have someone who like is someone of a liberal belief or even an atheist come and present to us, because there's something they could teach us. It may not, like we don't have to scrap our foundation, but there's something that they could probably teach us about some topic. Are we willing to listen to that? And it was kind of like, whoa, like, right? Like you can't say those things. So I just, can you talk a little bit about books and how, what's a smart way? Because we can also go off the rails, right? And get down a bad track of reading the wrong book. So how do we use this wisely?
A lot of it depends on Christian maturity. So if you're a younger Christian, either in age or just new to the faith, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you populate your bookshelf with a bunch of atheists or anti-Christian writers, because that's probably not going to be healthy for you. So I think a lot of this recommendation is probably, the caveat is, if you really have that solid grounding in those first couple layers, namely the church and the Bible at the bottom, it really should free you up to be a consumer of all sorts of art and culture and books, because you ultimately have something to measure it against and to be able to sift through and to say, this is edifying and helpful and this is not helpful. And you don't have that critical ability if you're not grounded in that first layer. There is a kind of accumulation of negative ideas and negative images and unedifying content that isn't good for your soul, right? So in moderation, I think being exposed to things that are challenging that you might disagree with is helpful, because it actually sharpens your beliefs and helps you to be well equipped to maybe respond in a conversation with a non-Christian friend. They might bring up an argument that you've already encountered in a book by a skeptic or an atheist or whatever. So it's all just helping you become wise by giving you kind of that training to train your muscles for critical thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine a world without C.S. Lewis, but I also can't imagine a literary world without John Steinbeck. So, I mean, it is so important to be willing to kind of get outside of our lane.
It's so liberating what you're saying. If you can really hold on to a solid base, if that is really what you live your life for Jesus and his revealed truth through Scripture, you are free to assess. You are free to look at this world. And obviously there's stuff that is clearly harmful and there's no assessing. But I want to just pause and say how freeing that is, which kind of connects to the fifth level, which is beauty, which I really, really loved. Beauty is something you can't touch like a book. It's feeling, it's tone, it's resonance to truth. And you even go in and talk about the contrast of beauty and tension, which, we're our podcast is all about tension. That topic of tension is something that has just been in my brain for a decade. So just talk about this, because to me, this is maybe one of the most freeing layers of the pyramid if people can grab onto what exactly you're talking about. So tell us about beauty.
God created us to perceive his creation through all of our senses. And that's why, the arts and beauty and things like music appeal to us on a deep kind of gut level that we can't fully articulate, right? To this day, I haven't read anything by any kind of aesthetic philosopher as to why music is universally something that resonates with humans, right? What is that? So there's something in this realm of beauty that connects with humans beyond what we can articulate logically and through kind of the head knowledge. And I just think it's so important for us to, as Christians who, evangelical Protestants particularly, haven't always valued the arts and beauty precisely because they're not logical, and it's not like word based, and it's not super clear necessarily what the takeaway value is. It's not efficient as a communication device because the arts by nature are sometimes ambiguous, and there's different interpretations that you can give. And music especially, like if there's no words in the music, if you're just talking about like a Bach concerto or Mozart or something, like you can't like point to that and be like, the message of that song is blank. You don't talk in those terms with the arts because it's about this intangible experience that nevertheless, I think a lot of even non-believers would describe the experience of the arts in terms of transcendence. I've had conversations with non-Christian secular friends who describe like a concert experience that they had as like a transcendent moment in their life. And I'm like, that's interesting, because in theory, they don't believe in God, they don't believe in the supernatural, but they're experiencing something they describe as transcendence. And I think that's because God is a God of beauty. He created this extravagant world that is far more beautiful and abundant than it needs to be. It's a world where chocolate exists. That's unnecessary. That's extravagant. Wisdom at its root is connectedness to God as the source of all wisdom. Well, he is beauty incarnate. He is the ultimate artist. And so downstream from that, when his image bearers, because they are wired to be like him, to be creative, to try to make things of the raw materials of the world, there's a connection to God in that. Even if the one who's doing the making, even if the artist is like a hardened atheist who denies God's existence, they are nevertheless participating in this act of creation, which is endowed directly by the creator God. So yeah, I think beauty is so important. It's important precisely because it's unimportant, right? There's nothing pragmatic. There's nothing efficient about it. It speaks to the abundance and excess of a loving God who is far greater and far more beautiful than he needs to be. The world he created is more beautiful than it needs to be. And that's why it's a source of wisdom for us. And I do want to say, like what we were talking about with books in terms of like maturity being an important caveat, like in terms of reading diversely. like I said earlier, I think that's especially true in the realm of the arts, because speaking as a movie critic for a profession, there is a lot of really unedifying, bad for you movies that are out there that I do not recommend people watch, and that I myself refuse to watch because I know that there's not going to be anything helpful for my wisdom in that. And I think that, you mentioned like this is liberating, and I think that there's liberation in that. Like, being free to say no to things is a form of liberation. If we are not free to say no, like if you're like a 20 something evangelical and you don't want to be a legalist, and you want to be open to every movie that's out there and every form of music, that's actually stifling. That's not freeing. Freedom is the ability to say yes to this and no to that, and to not have any guilt about it, and to not feel like I'm losing social status by refusing to watch that movie or refusing to listen to that music. So there's liberation in having a lot of things that you are willing to explore and consume, but also having the freedom to say no to things.
What you're writing, what we're talking about, it resonates with so many of us. We know there's sickness. We know that we're not well. You mentioned that as a society, like we kind of collectively know we're not doing well. And yet, like we continue to sort of feed into it because, we're all kind of acting like 20 somethings, thinking that we have to like make sure our kids fit in, and, their kids have to have the latest phones and the latest fashions and see the latest movies. And like, we all know there's a problem with that, but yet we're really struggling, I think, as a body to actually follow through with what we know will make us better. And that's, I think that's a thing I've been struggling with, that tension of, not wanting to set my kid out there to be ostracized as the one kid in their class who doesn't have a cell phone, or the one kid who can't go see the unedifying movie. And it's really hard. It really is in this day and age.
It is hard, but like I said, there's there's liberation in less. Like there, in terms of like, even like Netflix, like there's so much on Netflix, and you're constantly getting recommendations from your friends. Like, you have to watch this show, you have to watch this show. And it can feel burdensome to like have FOMO and to be like, oh, I need to catch up on that. I need to consume that. I need to watch that. It's actually far more liberating to just be like, I'm okay not watching all the things. I'm okay reining my overall media consumption in, even if it means I'm missing out on some good things, right? Too much of a good thing is still a bad thing. I focus a lot of my attention on keeping up with movies and music, and there's only so much time I have, and I'm not going to have guilt or feel pressure to listen to all the podcasts and read all the books and watch all the shows. It's actually more freeing to be at peace with like less, right? Less is more. And it also helps you go deeper if wisdom, like I talked about earlier, is the ability to go deeper than the surface in how we think about things and process things. It's easier to do that when you have less to digest, right? If you've only watched one movie in the last week or 2 weeks, then it gives you more space in your life to think about that. If you're not just rushing from like one streaming series to the next streaming series to the next, or one book that you bought on Amazon to the next book that you bought on Amazon, and just like consuming, you never have time to really let that food digest well, right? And just like in eating physical food, if you eat too quickly and you never let your food digest, it's not good for your health. And for our wisdom, we need to have space for things to actually like turn into nutrition in our soul, because we actually give space to like percolate and to think about it. So all that to say, the less is more approach, even if you're socially, you feel social pressure to like be up on all the things. I think for Christians, especially pastorally, we need to be giving people permission to be out of the loop. Cultural relevance, I'm increasingly convinced, is being culturally out of the loop.
you know it's out of whack if you flip the pyramid the other way. And one thing I was thinking about, obviously we've talked about social media, right? Coming up, we've talked about that problem, but this is what occurred to me as we were talking. The second one up, beauty, guess who was taken by their own beauty? Satan. Satan saw how beautiful he was and he fell. Then we go up to wisdom. Who fell because of tremendous wisdom? It was Solomon, right? Like if you flip the pyramid upside down and don't keep that base, you're gonna get off course. So that to me is a really helpful reminder to know, how do I have this oriented, and am I coming up? I'm coming up the line. But so what are your, as we conclude, what do you want to kind of summarize to the listener? What's your thing you want to say?
Just going off what you just said, Neil, like it's all just about putting things in their proper place. So the internet and social media is not all bad. There's good things to be found there. So it has a place in your diet. And there, I like we talked about, I work for a website for a living, so I have to believe that there are edifying things to be found on your smartphone from time to time. But it is a matter of proportion. So if you flipped it so that you're functionally living this life where what's on your phone and what comes across your feed is the dominant source that is feeding your soul, and if you're honest, you're like, yeah, from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed, I'm just scrolling. I pull my phone out at every opportunity. When I'm at a stoplight in my car and I have 10 seconds, I pull out my phone and I scroll. When I'm at Starbucks and I'm waiting for my latte and I have 2 minutes of downtime, I pull out my phone and I scroll. That shows that you have flipped the wisdom pyramid, and you've taken something that should occupy a small part of your diet and you've made it the staple, the foundational source. And that's where we become unhealthy. And that's where just someone who would make brownies or cookies the foundation of their diet, like they're not going to be healthy, right? It's not going to go well for their health. And social media especially, I feel like, is the equivalent of like a buffet of cookies. It's sweet and it's attractive and it tastes good and it's addictive. But if we spend too much time consuming that kind of junk food, it's not going to be good for our health. So that's what I would leave people with, is this food comparison of just like we need to be mindful of for our physical health of where we put certain things in priority areas. You need to think about that with what's feeding your soul. And I think all of us would do well to kind of do an audit of like brutal honesty. If you look at all the things that are feeding you today, where does your Bible fit? Is the Bible in the smallest part at the top of the pyramid and your phone is actually in the bottom? Most of us probably functionally live that way today, and that's a big part of the problem. So yeah, I just encourage people to look at the graphic and let it be kind of a gut check for you. Like, audit your life and try to think, is my pyramid a little bit upside down compared to this? And what steps can I take little by little to institute habits of intake that are a little bit more in line with sources of nourishment that are proximate to God as the ultimate source of nourishment and truth.
Well, Brett, we really appreciate you coming by or actually us visiting you on our virtual road trip to talk about this. Really insightful. I've really enjoyed this book. I think your investment of time to do this was worth it. I really do. I think it's gonna have impact. I hope the listener does do what you're saying and audits their time and takes it seriously. So thanks for joining us, and thank you, listener, for joining us again for another episode of A World in Tension.